How does oak aging change wine and whiskey flavor, color, and texture? What do glass gears and automatons have to do with the invention of distillation? And why is yeast such an essential tool in scientific research and wine production, especially in the face of climate change? In today's episode, you'll hear the stories and tips that answer those questions in part 2 of our chat with Adam Rogers. You don't need to have listened to part 1 first from last week, but if you missed it, go back and have a listen after you finish this one. By the end of our conversation, you'll also discover why sugar deserves the title of the most important molecule in the world. Yes, it's beating out water, in Adam's opinion. Speaking of water, how human saliva is used in the production of Chicha, one of the oldest types of alcoholic beverages. What microbial terroir is and how it affects the flavor profile of fermented drinks. How the process of distillation actually works. The most important thing we can learn from the alchemists. Whether the shape of a distillation still is important to the process, even that little dent in the corner. What's happening to spirits while they age in barrels? The major innovations to aging wine and whiskeys more quickly, and why some people lose their sense of smell after a concussion. Do you have a thirst to learn about wine? Do you love stories about wonderfully obsessive people, hauntingly beautiful places, and amusingly awkward social situations? Well, that's the blend here on the Unreserved Wine Talk podcast. I'm your host, Natalie McLean, and each week I share with you unfiltered conversations with celebrities in the wine world, as well as confessions from my own tipsy journey as I write my 3rd book on this subject. I'm so glad you're here. Now pass me that bottle, please, and let's get started. Welcome to episode 331. City TV's Breakfast Television, which airs nationally to 3.3 million viewers, recently did a complete makeover with a new set, new location, and new hosts, Dina Pugliese and Tim Bolin. I've known Dina and Tim for years, so it was like a homecoming when they asked me to be on the show shortly after their launch. I'll share the wines, whiskeys, and tips that we discussed with you now. Spring is in the air, and with it comes a sense of renewal. So what better way to toast a fresh start than with some tasty wines and spirits? And who better to lead the toast than our favorite drinks expert, Natalie McLean, editor of Canada's largest wine review site at nataliemclean.com. Dina and Tim, it's great to raise a glass with the two of you in your new roles on this beautiful new set. Did you know that new beginnings are just like wine and whiskey barrels? They're full of promise, occasionally under pressure, but always improving with time. And the good news is that unlike the barrels, the two of you won't need to be stored in a cool, dark place to reach your full potential. So I've grouped these wines and whiskeys in 2s in honor of you as the dynamic new duo, so feel free to smell or taste these first 2 wines from the Niagara winery, Big Head. Now, I immediately thought of you when I selected Big Head wines, not for ego, but for your imagination and the big creative ideas that you're bringing to this show. In fact, the versatile Chardonnay reminds me of Dina, from producer to entertainment reporter and now back to hosting BT. And like Dina, this wine is zesty with its aromas of crunchy golden apple and warm buttered toast. And I'm not saying that Dina smells like warm buttered toast, though if she did, it would definitely be artisanal sourdough. On the palate, this Chardonnay is rich and complex with a beautiful mineral backbone that gives it elegance and longevity. I pair it with a spring awakening risotto made with tender asparagus, fresh peas, and delicate lemon zest that brings out the wine's crisp acidity, all finished with shavings of aged Parmesan that echoes the wine's complexity. The robust Cabernet Sauvignon Select reminds me of your career trajectory, Tim. It starts bold, if a little rough around the edges, then continues to develop with complexity and depth as it opens up, just like your journey from sports reporting to anchoring this show with Dina. The Cabernet is bursting with notes of blackcurrant, cedar, and a hint of dark chocolate. There's a wonderful structure to this wine with firm tannins that will help age it beautifully. I'd pair this with New Horizons beef tenderloin, crusted with cracked black pepper and fresh herbs, seared to perfection with a caramelized exterior and a tender, juicy center, served alongside roasted root vegetables that bring out the earthy notes in the wine. Did you know that Niagara-on-the-Lake has a unique microclimate created by Lake Ontario that helps protect the vines from the extreme temperature fluctuations? This allows winemakers to produce these exceptional cool climate wines with both power and elegance. Next up, we have these Tread Softly wines from Australia that are brand new to the market here this month. Not only are they certified sustainable and bottled in lightweight glass, but they also plant a tree for every case sold. So far, they've planted 2.5 million trees, the equivalent of taking 35,000 cars off the road. Wow. We're going green here. Tim, in order of your Irish heritage, the Pinot Grigio is crisp and refreshing, with notes of green apple and lime zest. It's lighter in alcohol than many Australian wines, but still full of character. I'd pair this with Gentle Beginnings seafood ceviche, where delicate pieces of fresh scallops and snapper are lightly cooked in lime juice, tossed with crisp cucumber, ripe avocado, and a fragrant cilantro that together match the wine's bright, clean profile. Their silky smooth Pinot Noir is all about ripe cherries and subtle spice. It has a lingering finish that stays with you long after the last drop, much like Dina's smile after the show is over. Aww. A fascinating fact about Pinot Noir, it's one of the oldest grape varieties in the world, dating back more than 2,000 years. It's also one of the most genetically unstable grapes, which is why you find it in so many different clones and expressions around the world. I'd pair this with a duck breast seared until the skin is crackling crisp, then sliced thin to reveal a perfectly pink interior, served with a cherry reduction sauce that mirrors the wine's fruit notes and wild mushroom risotto that complements its earthy undertones. Next up, I have the superb Reserva 120 wines from Santa Rita in Chile. The Sauvignon Blanc is bursting with lemon zest, bold and confident like Dina, as someone who thrives on a fast-paced morning show. The 120 commemorates the 120 resistance fighters who battled the invading Spanish army to secure Chile's national independence in 1823. The winery hid them in their cellars and saved their lives. So these wines aren't just a taste of Chile, they're also a sip of history. This vibrant and refreshing Sauvignon Blanc with tropical fruit notes and a clean, crisp finish would go well with an Italian-inspired welcome back linguine al vongole, where tender clams are gently steamed open in a fragrant broth of white wine, garlic, and fresh parsley, then tossed with al dente pasta that's been finished in a briny, aromatic cooking liquid. Oh my lord, getting hungry and thirsty. The bright acidity of this wine cuts through the richness of the dish while complementing the delicate flavors of the seafood, much like how Dina's vibrant personality has been lighting up TV screens since 2006. The Santa Rita Cabernet Sauvignon 120 Reserva offers aromas of blackcurrant and cedar. It's modern with a classic twist, much like your bow ties and sartorial sensibility, Tim. I pair this with a homecoming celebration ossobuco, where veal shanks are slowly braised in a rich tomato sauce with vegetables and herbs until the meat is fall off the bone tender and served with saffron risotto that soaks up all those amazing flavors. A nod to your Woodbridge roots and Italian background, Dina. Now we're shifting to spirits. In 1972, the 40 Creek Distillery opened and more recently was named Whisky Maker of the Decade at the Canadian Whisky Awards. Tim, you attended Brock University in the heart of Niagara wine country. Well, 40 Creek Copper Bold has intense toffee aromas like bourbon, but with some spicy rye notes. The whiskey gets educated through extended barrel aging, creating incredible complexity, much like your morning commentary, Tim. Did you know that Canadian whiskey must be aged for at least 3 years in wooden barrels. 40 Creek takes this much further with their special aging process, creating their distinctive, smooth yet complex profile. I'd pair this with a fresh perspective maple glazed bacon where thick-cut artisanal bacon is slowly baked with pure Canadian maple syrup until it achieves that perfect balance of sweet, salty, smoky, and crisp, an irresistible accompaniment to this premium whiskey. We also have the 40 Creek Honey Spiced Whiskey. It's spiced but subtly sweet, so it hits the middle ground between bourbon and rye. Serve it with lemonade for a refreshing drink as we head into warmer weather. And for our grand finale, we have the Fireball Cinnamon Whiskey, originally developed in Canada in the mid-1980s and has become one of the country's most popular whiskey brands. It's still made in their old Montreal distillery, a blend of Canadian whiskey with natural cinnamon flavor to give it that fiery kick, much like your punny humor, Dina, not to mention your curling iron karaoke. You and it bring warmth and fun to any occasion. The brand new Fireball Apple Cinnamon ready-to-drink format brings together ripe, juicy, sparkling apple juice with the cinnamon spice of Fireball. It's the perfect combo for pure refreshment. Here we come, summer. I'd pair this with Brave New World dark chocolate fondue, where the richness of the melted bittersweet chocolate is enhanced with a hint of cayenne pepper to mirror the whiskey's spiciness, served with fresh strawberries, banana slices, and a buttery pound cake cubes for dipping into the velvety, decadent mixture. So, my final words of wisdom, I'd like to offer a toast. Here's to embracing change with open arms and open hearts, with full glasses for brand new starts. All right, so I'm always looking for your suggestions for upcoming segments on City TV's Breakfast Television, CTV Morning Live, The Social, Global's Morning Show, and CHCH Morning Live, about drinks for spring, Easter, Earth Day, Mother's Day, Father's Day, barbecue, and Canada Day. So if you have wines, spirits, beer, cocktails, or mixed drinks to suggest, whether they're alcoholic or not, please let me know. Meanwhile, I'm reviewing my favorite drinks over on Instagram at Natalie McLean Wine. Connect with me there. Back to today's guest. One of you will win a copy of Adam's terrific second book, Full Spectrum, How the Science of Color Made Us Modern. And I'm pleased to announce 2 winners of the book On Tuscany, From Brunello to Bolligheri, Tales from the Heart of Italy. They are Dawn Bohart from Tillsonburg, Ontario, and Lucia Capretti from Vancouver. I also still have 2 copies of Fiona Morrison's 10 Great Wine Families, A Tour Through Europe, and 2 of Rosemary George's book, The Wines of Languedoc. These are gorgeous books with full-color photos and maps. You can live anywhere in the world to win these, by the way. All you have to do is email me and let me know you'd like to win. I'll choose 5 winners randomly from those who contact me at natalie@nataliemclean.com. In other bookish news, if you're reading the paperback or ebook or listening to the audiobook of my memoir, Wine Witch on Fire, Rising from the Ashes of Divorce, Defamation, and Drinking Too Much, a national bestseller and one of Amazon's best books of the year, I'd love to hear from you at natalie@nataliemclean.com. I'd be happy to send you beautifully designed, personally signed book plates for the copies you buy or give as gifts. I'll put a link in the show notes to all retailers worldwide at nataliemclean.com/331. The paperback usually arrives within a day or 2 of ordering. The ebook and audiobook are instantly available. Magic. Okay, on with the show. You've noted that different yeast strains are designed to create different flavors. Some yeasts now will lower alcohol. I've heard of power yeasts that will produce turbo alcohol, high alcohol, although that's going out of fashion, especially in wine. Are there other things that new yeasts are being bred to do?
Yeah, it's a tough row to hoe. Wrong substrate, I know, but because of concerns about GMOs.
Right. And those are banned in the EU, right?
So if you're trying to make wine there, they'll get mad at you if you have a genetically modified yeast. But the reason that yeast are also a workhorse organism in laboratories is that they're very easy to change traits, to change their genetics. They share DNA with each other. when they grow, they tend to mutate very quickly. Like generation to generation will change. So you can use kind of classic animal or microbial husbandry techniques to change them as well, to look for particular traits. This is, I think, going to become especially important as climate change changes the regions that are important wine producers. As places like Napa and Sonoma become too hot to grow the kind of grapes that they grow, or as places like Australia get super hot when they still want to grow grapes and varietals that really kind of favor a cooler climate generally, or seen to do that, that maybe you can develop yeasts that can respond to those stresses and still produce more of the flavor chemical, the flavor molecules that you want out of those particular strains. You have to identify what those molecules are. That's a hard part. That would be one approach. I mean, it's sort of like it's that, or Napa cedes all of its importance to Washington State. Those are your choices. So,
Yeah, no, that would be great if they could come up with something like that and still to protect the signature of Napa or wherever you're talking about. Moving on to sugar. You describe sugar as the most important molecule on Earth. That's a bold, bold claim, Adam. Can you explain why sugar deserves this title over other contenders like, say, water?
yeah, sure. I'm obviously being provocative in that statement, but to me, water's medium. Water's the thing where all this chemistry happens. But the other stuff, the other chemicals are message. And sugar especially, because it has so many different functions. Sugar is another storage of another way to store energy. It's a complicated molecule. The molecular bonds keep a lot of energy tied up in there, so you can eat it, and it gives you a lot of calories of vim and vigor for any animal, not just us. But also because it can be structural. You can assemble sugar molecules like Lego pieces to build all kinds of other stuff. One of those things is starch. Starch is a big, complicated polysaccharide. Poly is many, saccharide is sugar. But if you do a few little tweaks of those molecules, if you assemble sugar molecules in a slightly different way, you get cellulose, which is wood or stuff that makes up plants. It's the most common molecule on Earth. Maybe this record books change. And if you assemble it again slightly differently, add a nitrogen in there, you get something called chitin, which is the stuff that crab and lobster shells, and it's also the cell wall in yeast. Yeast have chitin, which is kind of weird that they have that. Another super common on Earth, super common molecule for life. So these are all sort of sugar and sugar derived. Even DNA, even genetic material is a sugar backbone. That's the structural part of our genetic material is a sugar.
Is that the ribose?
That's the ribose, yeah, exactly. That's right. The ribose and deoxyribonucleic acid. That's right.
There you go. Okay, yeah, all right. So we've covered sugar well enough now. Let's go on to, we'd be here for 3 hours. Fermentation. Let's get to some of the action here. Some of the oldest alcoholic beverages in history, like Chicha, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that correctly, relied on human saliva to start fermentation. That just caught my eye.
Weird.
Like, how did that work? It's weird. Yeah.
So you and I and a lot of other animals can digest starch. We have an enzyme in our saliva called amylase. ASE is the enzyme part. The amyl is the starch part in this case, that breaks down starch into the sugars that we can digest. Yeast cannot do this. They can't digest starch. And huge amounts of the sugar in plants is locked up as starch. So if you want to take the sugar in a plant, especially in a grain, like a corn or a barley, and ferment it, you have to simplify the sugars. You got to break them apart. And there are a bunch of different ways to do that. The malting process is a way to do that. Asian spirits use koji, is another fungus that can digest the starch, turn it into sugar before the yeast get to it. Chicha, which is a South American corn-based fermented product, the way they would make it is that basically women, because a lot of this production stuff was seen as women's work until it was industrialized, just like the rest of human industrial history, would sort of sit and chew the corn in there, like masticate it in their mouth. So the amylase in their starch would break down in their saliva, would break down the starch into sugars, and then they would kind of spit it out and make a little patty of this blue corn and let it dry in the sun. So get rid of the cooties, right, basically. And then they would use that and ferment that into the drink. I've actually never had it, and I really want to try it because it sounds weird as hell.
It does. You need to have one of those village visits or whatever. Another story for your next book. And we often think of fermentation as yeast turning sugar into alcohol, but you write about the microbial terroir, which we may have already touched on. What do you mean by the microbial terroir?
Two things. Yeast make a lot of other chemicals in that digestive process. That transformation of sugar doesn't only create alcohol. It creates other alcohols other than ethanol, which is the one that we think of most often, and also other chemicals that have flavors and aromas. So Well, we were talking about that yeasty flavor that a pet nat will have or that a sour beer will have. Those are those other molecules making their presence known. You can get a yeast strain that has very few of those, so you have something that doesn't show that, or you can get a wild type yeast that's really crazy and, go nuts. But also there are other kinds of microbes in the environment that you can also allow into your fermentation. This is especially true in rums, especially true in rum agricoles. Rum agricole ferments and then distills clear sugarcane juice. Most of the rum, the sort of Bacardi type rum that you get at the Target or whatever, is usually using molasses as the substrate. So when you're making sugar, you get the white sugar that comes out that you put in your coffee or whatever, and then molasses is a byproduct of it. What do you do with that? Well, you can ferment it and distill it and make rum. You can also just take the cane juice and do that. But when you do, you have to go really fast because it's pure microbe food. And so not just the yeast that you want will settle on it, but other yeasts and other stuff from the environment will settle on it too. And in fact, some of them will make flavors so crazy that there are some rum makers who will actually scrape the gunk out of the still, bury it for a while, let it grow like all kinds of weird stuff, like the blooms that, if something goes bad in your refrigerator and you're like, oh, I've got a little colony or whatever, I better throw that away. They want those to happen. And then they'll actually mix some of that back into the product. There's nothing toxic in it. And all the weird stuff gets killed, but you get the flavors.
Okay. What flavors would that blue gunk make? Would it be just sort of subtle feral underlying?
Feral's a good word there. Yeah. Have you ever had a rum that you describe as like funky and grass-like?
No, but I like that word. I can use it now.
It's those. You taste and you're like, wow, that's got they can be almost meaty. Like they're very umami flavors. They juxtapose really interestingly with the sweetness of a rum. There are a few rum makers that especially, so not the Jamaican rum makers as much, but like the Barbadian rum makers, some of the other islands, other Caribbean rums, where you're tasting, you're like, whoa, that is weird. Like that is not a daiquiri rum. That's something else. That's like you want to make a teponge out of that or something real like aggressive.
A what? Sorry, a teponge?
It's rum, about a $50 sized slice cut out of the outside of a lime, muddled into some syrup, and then just a dollop of rum. It's one of my favorite rum drinks. They're great. So
that sounds great. Very thunky too. So again, the process really clarified things for me, the organization of your book, because I focus mostly on wine and not a lot on spirits, though I'm really keen to learn. So distillation, the way you positioned it, to me, seems like it moves, a step beyond fermentation. So distilled wine gives us brandy, distilled beer gives us whiskey. And you describe distillation poetically as the apotheosis of human life on Earth. Now, what do we mean by that?
Perhaps, again, I'm being somewhat provocative when I say that. Here's why I think that. It's one of the first, really among the first, and it comes at a moment of intense technological development for humanity. So depending on how you believe these histories, distillation gets developed sometimes sort of in the first 200 to 300 years of the Common Era. And it comes out of a moment when people are just becoming the engineers that we are, when they're really starting to transform naturally occurring phenomena into a technology that can exist in a temple or in the home. And distillation is one of those technologies, along with a lot of automatons and sort of all of the simple machines, the gears and the screws and the steam engines. The earliest moments of saying, hey, if I dig up enough of those really interesting dirt and cook it long enough to turn it into this really hard stuff and combine it with, if I melt sand, it turns into this clear thing that's really hard. It'll break, but it's also, clear and beautiful. They're figuring out glass. They're figuring out ceramics. They're figuring out metal. They're figuring out gears. They're figuring out all of the things that are the underpinnings of the built environment today. And distillation is one of those. Distillation happens in those same labs, basically, and those same people are figuring that out too.
I love that. Just a hive of human achievement and curiosity. As you noted, fermentation would happen without us, but distillation requires human intervention. You call distillation a technology, but not chemistry. What's the difference to you?
Well, chemistry is something that also probably happens. You discover biochemistry. Those are processes that a human scientist can unpack and then take advantage of. But in order for a distillation to happen, distillation is fundamentally a separation technology. It's like a strainer or a centrifuge, using gravity, spin things around. The heavy stuff goes to the bottom.
Out.
Right. The heavy stuff goes to the bottom.
Or evaporation.
Evaporation's one, right. So A still is basically using evaporation, using vapor pressure. What that means is you heat stuff, and at different temperatures, different liquids turn into steam, turn into a vapor. And what a still does is heat this mass of fermented liquid, and the lighter molecules turn into vapor first, go up the still, and then go over the top. So the heavy stuff stays behind, the lighter stuff goes over. The lighter stuff tends to be the alcohols. And the first run of that is like methanol and things that'll make you go blind and kill you. And so you don't want to use that. Don't throw that away or use that for cleaning. And then you keep the middle part, the center cut that comes out. So in order to make that happen, you have to know how to manipulate metal. You have to know how to manipulate fire. You have to know how to manipulate cold because you have to chill that vapor coming out over the top. You have to understand a whole lot of basic physics and chemistry and then metallurgy and design to build this thing that becomes what we know as a still.
Right, right. Ah, fascinating. The early distillers, the alchemists, were trying to separate the spirit or soul from an object, from its physical body. So some were trying to get gold from lead. And what was the most important thing you think the alchemists taught us?
I love the alchemists. I think they get a bad rap. We think of alchemists as being, flim-flam guys, basically, as being grifters. Because you can't make lead into gold. But the practices that they developed, the methods, the methodologies, still became critical for chemistry and became critical for physics, even if what they were doing was nonsense, largely. Well, two things. One, I think it's important that at least this story of how distillation was created, it was created in a lab of a woman scientist in the sort of 200 Common Era or so. A woman named Maria the Jewess is how she's accounted for. And because the history here is so old and not reliable, did she really exist? Did she really do it? But maybe. But it's one of the stories that we tell here, that distillation was invented by this woman in her lab that she had in Alexandria. I also think, and this one's just me, I've known a lot of postdocs and graduate students and in the sciences, and they're always fermenting and distilling stuff. And I just assume that Maria was trying to distill the spirits of the fundamental golds that existed in the Philosopher's Stone or whatever. And then her students were like, buddy, what if we put beer in there? What do you think will happen, right?
Around the world and through time trying to make alcohol.
That's my assumption. That's my working assumption. Yeah, yes.
That's a good assumption. Absolutely. And her name goes on in one of the Olympic stills, the Bon Marie.
Bon Marie, the double boiler. Right. I mean, you might have one in your kitchen. I have one in my kitchen. And it's also a lab, still in labs today. It's still called the Bon Marie. And it's named after her. Yeah. Maria's bath.
Maria's bath. Nice bath. So I know that distillers, they all have their secret recipes and whatever, but I think it was you mentioned somewhere when they try to replicate a still, because they last 30 or 40 years before they sort of give out and have to be replaced, they replicate small dents because they believe that is there any scientific evidence really that a small dent, putting it back in there, is going to affect the taste of the spirit?
No, it's one of those things that has both intuitive power. You can understand how it might be true. Yeah, okay, I buy that, because inside the still, as this heating process is happening, especially in the batch kind of stills that single malt uses and craft distillers will use, where there's sort of an onion shape. It's got that ball like this, and then the tall stalk, right? So inside this part, stuff is all heating, and the vapors go up, and then they condense on the inside of that and drip back down. And so the different shapes allow different flavors to make their way out. You can have a tall, skinny one of those, or when you get a lot of oily flavors, and a little fat one, because stuff stays in the bottom for longer. So sure. Has anybody ever tested it? Well, no, but commercially they test it. So there are stories about, for example, as a business, the single malt whiskey business in Scotland has its ups and downs. And in the last sort of decade or decade and a half, there was an attempt at a lot of rapid expansion to try to deal with the market in China, and they kind of messed a lot of stuff up in doing it. But one of the things there's a famous story of a distillery that tried to expand by basically replicating the stills, the exact same shape, because there's only one or two real still makers at that level, and they keep all the records. So they just built two more of the stills just down the road. But they got something wrong, because the stuff that came out of those stills didn't taste like the stuff that was in their original ones, and they didn't know what. They had to change what they made, change the labeling, because it just didn't taste the same. There was something different about the location, about the stills, about how they heated them, about who touched the grain. Nobody knows. But these little differences manifest in the flavor that you get at the other end.
Huh. Well, that's cool. And then you've noted some really weird things have been distilled. Just to finish off this, why are they distilling things like foie gras, mushrooms, and what, donuts?
Well, okay, so there's two groups here that you do the donuts because it's just a source of sugar. And I've tasted that. You're just proving that any source of sugar can be run and distilled, because what we think of in the U.S. as moonshine is that like good old country boys up in the holler with their like backwoods still making stuff. That has evolved into a corn-based whiskey called bourbon in the United States. But really, those guys were probably just distilling from white sugar. Just whatever sugar source they could get, any kind of fruit, anything, just to have enough sugar that they could get enough yield off of it. Somebody was having fun, but they did it with donuts because they're so sugary to prove that you could do it. Tasted terrible.
Tasted terrible. There's definitely a hole in the middle, I'm sure, with the mid palate. Anyway.
That's right. You got a good nose, delicious finish, but something missing. I'm friendly with a distiller named Lance Winters. He's got a small, medium-sized distillery here in the Bay Area in California called St. George Spirits. And he was doing it as an experimental process to try to understand distilling and get at kind of what's powerful about distilling, both as a metaphor and also as a technology, is that it really gets at the fundamental essence of something. My experience of this is usually like if you have the best apricot eau de vie, will taste like the best apricot you've ever had. Like the specs for an apricot, like the apricot that you had when you were 12 on a perfect summer day that you picked off a tree that was perfectly ripe and that you were having the best day of your life with your family and you had that apricot. You're like, that's what a great apricot eau de vie tastes like. Because distillation will get rid of all the extraneous stuff and just get to the center of something, which is also the metaphor for distilling, right? So Lance was trying to do that with other flavors to see if he could capture something fundamental about a foie gras or about seaweed or about a mushroom. And I tasted the seaweed one was really kind of a wild experience because it was like being on the ocean.
Was it?
Tasting it was like getting hit with a wave, like standing there and
great.
being hit with a wave. It really did that. And he knew it too. He was hilarious. He was like, yeah, I know. I got that one right. It's like he knew it. So it's possible.
Wow. You could commercialize that, I think.
It was idiosyncratic, I gotta tell you.
Oh, I see. The consistency would be an issue. Yeah. All right, on to aging. What's happening while the spirits are changing dramatically while they're aging? What are the key chemical reactions that are happening with that barrel?
Yeah, this is really interesting. And it's something that's hard to get to the center of because the people who are the best at it keep it a secret. This is like IP because it's so critical to what huge companies do with their business. But one of the things I love to do in a distillery, if I get the opportunity, is to taste the white dog, taste what comes out of the still. The first thing that comes out of the still.
Oh, the head before you get to the middle cut.
No. Yep. Taste what they're going to put into a barrel, but just before it goes into the barrel.
Okay, gotcha. Yeah.
Because the head will kill you, but
right.
I would it still be. I'm sure it tastes interesting. Methanol is
everything
a little bit sweeter.
Research.
Right.
Yeah, they called a white dog. Okay.
In the U.S., it's called white dog. Yeah, because it is everything that the spirit is going to be, except the aging. First of all, it also tastes good. It's super high alcohol when it comes out of the still, but you can still taste it. It can taste like some acid, like popcorn or like cereal, breakfast cereal flavors. Really interesting flavors that sometimes get covered by the wood. Wine has this, I was going to say has this problem too. Some people like it too, but that thing of like the classic, the over-oaked buttery Chardonnay.
Yeah, ketchup of the wine world, like oak. Yeah.
And it's the classic example of like, okay, well, I'm only tasting the wood. I'm only tasting the coconut lactones that come out of that inside surface of that new French oak, because French oak is a really oily, coconutty, buttery, like all these unctuous flavors come off the inside.
I thought American oak was the coconutty one, but is it French oak too?
I always get this backwards.
Well, in wine, it could be different in spirits. French oak is like vanilla spice and sort of closer grained, whereas American oak for wine is usually sweeter, coconutty. And then again, different woods could be imparting different things.
And you're going to be more right about this than I am, for sure. Well, I'll tell you the part of this that I was dopiest about. When you're drinking whiskey and it's that beautiful brown color, that's all from the wood. It is completely clear when it goes into a barrel and it's brown when it comes out. So color is part of what changes. And also all those flavors. And different spirits have different rules about how they age. So wine goes into new oak, bourbon goes into new oak, single malt whiskey goes into old oak. It has to have been used for something else, second fill. So they'll use a bourbon cask or a port cask or a sherry cask. So that'll get the flavor of whatever else has been in it, because the process of aging, as the temperature goes up and down, the pores in the wood open and close. So they'll open, the liquid gets drawn into that layer, the inside layer of the wood, and then gets pushed back out. So there's this kind of back and forth process, which is why so many of the experimental attempts to accelerate that process use heat to try to cycle it faster. And it's part of why people, by tradition more than anything else, will have younger American whiskeys than European whiskeys. Or certainly very young whiskeys that'll come out of the tropics, let's say the Indian whiskeys or Australian whiskeys, where they're just doing like 3 years of super fast cycling in and out of the wood.
Huh. Okay. Wow. Have there been, I mean, it's kind of the perhaps secret people would love to get or master, but maybe haven't. But has there been any successful experiments done to age wine and spirits even more quickly?
I mean, it depends on what you think of as success.
Yeah. Still tastes good? Doesn't taste confected?
People do it. And there are some brands. There's a company called Lost Spirits that has some a bunch of different sort of technological approaches to doing it faster. This becomes a matter of personal preference. I usually don't think it works. So like the classic move is for a small distillery to do a faster turnaround by using a smaller barrel. So smaller barrel means there's more exposure. But to my palate, the problem with that is that you get all of the extractive flavors from the wood, but none of the oxidation. So the other thing that happens over time is it oxidizes inside the barrel. So you don't get any of the oxidative flavors. You do get all the extractives. It tastes like green wood to me. To me, that doesn't work as well, but there's a business case to do it because they want to get product out the door. I think that's less common now than it was, when I was writing the book.
Sure. Well, they also throw wood chips into some cheaper wines just for that extraction, even faster, cheaper. So
right, tea bags full of sawdust, right?
Oh, really? Tea bags with sawdust?
Yeah.
Oh, that's really gross thought. But I guess they're competing in a certain price category, and yeah. All right, well, let's just motor through some of this because the time's flying, but this is so fascinating. Smell and taste, our most direct sense. As you say, when we smell wine, spirits, parts of our brain, dangling neurons are touching the aroma molecules. And it's the only part of our brain that is in direct contact with the sensory world, doesn't get interpreted by another part of the brain. What happens if we get a concussion? Why do people lose their sense of smell?
Oh, it's so weird. So that thing that you were just talking about, these afferent neurons, these receptors that are just attached to neural cables, basically neural wiring that goes up into our brain, into the olfactory cortex, the sensory part of our brain that does all the work of sorting out these molecules into what we think of as smells or aromas. All those dangly bits go through a bone called the cribriform plate. It's like, did you ever have a Play-Doh thing when you were a kid that you put the Play-Doh in and you press the lever and it comes out through the front through the dye, like a dye, and it comes out as spaghetti?
Yeah, I also put the Play-Doh in my nose as well.
Sure,
so it's kind of the same extrusion type thing to get it out, yeah.
And if I say Play-Doh, everybody who had it remembers what it smelled like too. It's a very characteristic smell.
It's true.
So you have to imagine the cribriform plate is like that dye that extrudes the spaghetti with the neurons dangling down. And then when you have a concussion, bonks your head and your brain, that's what a concussion is, right? All the brain stuff sloshes inside your skull it moves like this, but your skull doesn't. Well, when it does that against the cribriform plate, it just shears all that off.
Oof. So you've lost your sense of smell, the end parts that were picking up all the molecules.
Right. They're gone. And sometimes they grow back. They come back, they reform. The brain is more plastic than people give it credit for often. But yeah, that's what happens. And then with COVID, a lot of people lost their sense of smell with COVID too. And that was because those neurons, all those tissues, COVID could also infect those tissues. And so it could cause damage or cause them to be inflamed. So you wouldn't have sense of smell for a while. Wow.
Okay. My goodness. So let me just jump through some of these things because ethanol is unique because it has a molecule. It's so tiny and it can pass the blood-brain barrier and it can trigger both pain and pleasure, as we know. Why do some people seem more sensitive to it than others? We've heard about Asian flushing, don't have the enzyme or whatever, but what is there about ethanol? Different people react to it differently.
Ethanol is incredibly poorly understood compared to other psychoactive compounds. There's just not a lot of research into that. So probably because nobody's even really totally sure what brain receptor ethanol attaches to cause those effects.
So we know more about oxycodone than we do ethanol. Okay.
Very much so.
And why is that? Why don't we know more? Since we love it so much, it's a big part of our lives.
When you ask researchers who study it, they will say that it's basically a puritanical lack of desire for granting agencies like the government to seem like they're encouraging a vice, to be most sort of reductionist about it. I don't know if that's actually true, but that does seem right. Almost all of the research on the effects of alcohol is very reasonably dedicated to understanding addiction.
Right. Right.
Addiction is the part of this that has the most societal costs, so I understand it. That's most of what's going on. So the closest that I think people have gotten in, I will admit it's been a long time, so if one of your viewers has better research on this, I want to see it. But most of the stuff that I've seen, it's probably like a benzodiazepine, like a Valium or a Klonopin, which is why you're not supposed to take those while you're drinking, because they have synergistic effects, same receptors. So like 2 drinks in a Valium, you are out, right?
You're
gone.
done.
Dangerously gone.
Oh, dangerously gone. Okay.
Yeah, because they seem to affect the same receptors in the brain.
Okay. Maybe that's the con. All right. So a bit about hangovers. So we often hear that clear spirits give you fewer hangovers than dark spirits. Any truth?
Nah, I think that's nonsense.
Yeah. We thought congeners, those things that, whatever, the byproducts of fermentation.
Science is terrible, alas. I mean, it tends to be survey-based, and then we don't really like congeners, anything that's not water or alcohol. But I mean, I don't know about you, but I've certainly been hungover after vodka. Vodka doesn't have any congeners, or at least not supposed to. That science is it's dicey. And it's full of a lot of cultural memes that aren't really scientific. Like the thing about how people get a headache from red wine because of histamines. You've heard that, right?
Yeah, I've heard it. Yeah.
White wine has histamines too.
Yes.
It's inimical to the process, but people will say they don't get a headache from white wine. So you think, well, I believe people are getting a headache, but so maybe it's from something else. What? Nobody knows. The same kind of goes for like, well, which congener is it? Why would you, this is along the same lines as people who say that tequila makes them angry, but whiskey makes them happy or something. I'm like, well, how? You have to give me a mechanism. Maybe give me a hint what that mechanism might be, because really the only significant, as far as anybody knows, the only significant psychoactive compound in any of this stuff is alcohol, is ethanol. If there's something else in it, I want to know what it is, but nobody does.
Other than your own expectations of how it's going to make you act.
Very important.
Yeah, very. And to the taste, everything. There's been all kinds of studies. Dehydration really isn't it. That's another myth about hangovers, I assume.
You're definitely dehydrated, for sure. Alcohol suppresses a hormone called vasopressin. That's why you pee so much when you've been drinking. So you're certainly dehydrated, and that doesn't feel good. But if you rehydrate, you're still hungover. I don't know.
Absolutely. So we don't know about hangovers either. Oh my goodness. Okay. There's so much more to do, research. So your book was published in 2014. What new developments in the science of booze have surprised you most since then?
There have been a couple of things that I thought were pretty cool. There are some distillers who are taking a kind of more scientific approach to developing the recipes for what they're making, that aren't in the old standard categories. So there's a team of folks who used to be in the kitchen at Noma, which was the kind of molecular gastronomy place in Europe.
Copenhagen?
Yeah, thank you. I couldn't remember where it was. Some of them have started a distillery. They make a lot of weird, interesting stuff, basing the base spirit is pasilla peppers, and then they use all kinds of herbs and stuff. And they taste really interesting and are category defying. That's the thing that I like about them. You are like, is that a whiskey? Is that a gin? What is that? It's like, well, it's something new. They don't know. We don't know what to call it, which is fun. There's a company, a small distillery that I like for the idea of it, at least. They're mostly focusing, I think, on making fuel now, but they take basically carbon dioxide and then turn that into ethanol.
Oh,
because
it's
just right.
Or
yeah.
no.
So they do the chemistry on it to make an alcohol out of CO2 that you instead of letting the CO2 go to the atmosphere and cause climate change, you
That's a
use
good
it to
trade-off.
make a martini.
Yeah.
So I tried their vodka a few years ago, and it was fine, but it was fun. The idea of it was fun.
Okay. And now you have said that with all this research and so on, why do you say that people don't want to have drinks with you anymore, Adam?
We've been talking for a little bit more than an hour. I don't know. You tell me if this was interesting or annoying. You can imagine it might be a bit much sitting at a bar. Be like,
and
another
just
thing.
Started.
Yeah,
Order another round.
That's right. Oh, they have weird bitters. Bring that down. This stuff's got herbs in it. So.
Yeah. So you're all about the context and everything else. So I can just imagine. All right. Is there anything that we haven't covered that you wanted to bring up before we wrap up?
We mentioned at the top a little bit about the kind of theater of it and how much fun it is, that almost independent of what's actually in your glass, that the fun around it, of the environments can be so much part of the enjoyment of the experience. And I worry a little bit sometimes when I say that it sounds like I'm denigrating. I'm absolutely not. That's part of the experience. That is part of why this is so great. It's why that bottle of wine that you have at that little bistro that you find on a back street in the whatever arrondissement in Paris tastes so incredible there. And then when you get it home, watching it in front of the latest episode of Reacher, it's just not that great.
Yes.
It's still great. It's still great, but that's a different kind of moment.
Absolutely.
Not putting that, I'm just drinking wine in front of Reacher is one of life's great pleasures. But I also, there have been great experiments where people taste totally different things in a wine based on what color it is. Like the addition of food coloring to a white wine makes people taste it as though it's a red wine. And I just think what's important about that is to make this into a totalizing experience, to not try to tell ourselves, this is the part that I think is maybe an error. People disagree with me. The sommelier thing of like, okay, no, I'm here, I'm focused in. I'm going to do the color of it, in light, and I'm do the aroma in a glass, and then I get a sip, and I want to taste it on the front of my tongue and then the back, which is a little weird, but okay, fine. You get at least the retronasal olfaction of it, and also the taste flavors on your tongue, and then that's it. And now I'm going to identify what that wine is and make some decisions about what the flavor notes are and whether I like it. And for somebody like me, there's more. There's more of like, where do we buy this bottle? And did I get it at a restaurant where they did a big show of decanting it or something? That all of those things are joyful. They're part of the fun of it also.
Absolutely. I'll drink to that, Adam. Thank you so much. Where can we find you and your books online?
Books are whatever transnational oligopoly is selling books to you at the moment are available. Amazon has them, bookshop.com has them, bookshop.org, I guess they are. You can find links to those on my website, which is adam-rogers.net. And you can also listen to me saying outrageous puns on Blue Sky at Jetjocko, jetjocko.social.net. I can't remember how Blue Sky works like that. But anyway,
so
that's
new,
right.
Yeah. Well, we'll put links to all of that in the show notes too. So if people are writing that down. So thank you so much. I mean, this is just fascinating. I can't wait to re-listen to your book again, and I'll pick up more this time. Great stories, Adam. Great research, great writing. It was worth it. All that grind. It was worth it, Adam.
Thank you. I didn't mean to sound like I was complaining about it. I'm really glad. I'm really glad that you like the book. That's great.
Absolutely. No, from one writer to another. I know I've been there. Well, cheers. And I hope the next one is in person at a bar sometime, maybe.
Lovely. Thank you.
All right.
Thanks for having me.
All right. Thanks. Well, there you have it. I hope you enjoyed our chat with Adam. Here are my takeaways. Number 1, how does oak aging change wine and whiskey flavor and color? Well, when you're drinking whiskey, as Adam says, it has a beautiful amber color, and that's all from the wood. It's completely clear when it goes into the barrel, and it's brown when it comes out. So color is part of what changes, along with all those flavors. Different spirits use different rules about how they age them. So wine goes usually into new oak, not always. Bourbon goes into new oak. Single malt whiskey goes into old oak. The barrels have to have been used for something else, a second fill, as they say. So they'll use a bourbon cask or a port cask or a sherry cask so that the whiskey gets the flavor of whatever else has been in it. In the process of aging, as the temperature goes up and down, the pores of the wood open and close. And as they open, the liquid gets drawn into that layer inside the wood and then gets pushed back out again. I never knew that. So there's this kind of back and forth process, which is why so many of the experimental attempts to accelerate aging use heat to try to cycle that faster. And it's also why people drink more young American whiskeys than European whiskeys due to the warmth and the fact it ages more quickly. Number 2, what do glass gears and automatons have to do with the invention of distillation? Well, I'm glad you asked. Distillation was developed nearly 200 to 300 years ago in the Common Era. People were starting to transform naturally occurring phenomena into a technology that could exist, say, in a temple or in the home. Distillation is one of those technologies, along with A lot of automatons and simple machines, gears, screws, and the steam engines. They were also figuring out glass, ceramics, and metal. It was a very exciting time. Number 3, why is yeast such an essential tool both in scientific research and wine production, especially in the face of climate change? As Adam explains, yeasts are a workhorse organism in laboratories because it's very easy to change their traits and genetics. They share DNA with each other, and when they grow, they mutate very quickly from generation to generation. So you could use classic animal or microbial husbandry techniques to change them as well. This can become especially important as climate change changes the regions that are important to wine. Places like Napa and Sonoma are becoming too hot to grow the kind of grapes that they grow, whereas places like Australia get super hot, and they still want to grow grapes that favor a cooler climate. So you can develop a yeast that can respond to those heat stresses and still produce more of the flavor molecules that you want from these particular strains. In the show notes, you'll find the full transcript of my conversation with Adam, links to his website and books, the video versions of these conversations on Facebook and YouTube Live, and where you can order my book online now, no matter where you live. If you missed episode 253, go back and take a listen. I chat with Jane Lopez about her emotional guide to wine and how to get a solid wine education. I'll share a short clip with you now to whet your appetite.
It was the combination of all that wine offered, because wine can be very academic, very intellectual. I remember a lot of nights coming home from my job at the retail store and pulling out a wine book, but I really liked that knowledge was connected to an experience, a sensory experience. I could study the wines of the Northern Rhone and the soil type and the winemaking and the attributes of the Syrah grape, and then I could taste that in a glass. That to me was very exciting. And I also really loved the social aspects of it. When it came down to spending my 20s in a library or talking to people and serving great wine and pairing it with food, and the latter seemed a lot more appealing.
Absolutely. I'm with you on that, because wine does get you out of your head all the time if you're inclined to be there, and gets you reconnected with your senses and your body and the emotions.
Totally.
You won't want to miss next week when we chat with Henry Jeffries, the author of Empire of Booze and Vines in a Cold Climate, the latter of which was shortlisted for the James Beard Awards and won the Fortnum and Mason Drink Book of the Year. He joins us from his home in Kent, England. If you liked this episode or learned even one thing from it, please email or tell a friend about the podcast this week, especially someone you know who'd be interested in learning more about the science of wine. It's easy to find my podcast. Just tell them to search for Natalie MacLean Wine on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, their favorite podcast app, or they can listen to the show on my website at nataliemaclean.com/podcast. Email me if you have a sip tip question or if you'd like to win one of 8 copies of books by Adam, Fiona, Rosemary, and yes, 3 from Henry Jeffries if you want to get a jump on claiming one of his books, or if you've read my book or are listening to it. I'd also love to hear your thoughts about this episode, so email me at natalie@nataliemaclean.com. In the show notes, you'll find a link to take the free online food and wine pairing class with me called The 5 Wine and Food Pairing Mistakes That Can Ruin Your Dinner or Lunch and How to Fix Them Forever at nataliemaclean.com/class. That's all in the show notes at nataliemaclean.com/331. Thank you for taking the time to join me here. I hope something great is in your glass this week, perhaps a whiskey that was aged to perfection in oak. You don't want to miss one juicy episode of this podcast, especially the secret, full-bodied bonus episodes that I don't announce on social media. So subscribe for free now at nataliemaclean.com/subscribe. Meet me here next week. Cheers.